Welcome to the CEC Report. It's January 4th. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
So, Craig, this is the first CEC report for 2013. We've got a few timely things to discuss. Our first item today, fiscal cliff is nothing. Worry about hyperinflation. Jenny Macklin should get a real job. And finally, the South China Sea dispute can be solved without war. So first, the fiscal cliff is nothing. Worry about hyperinflation. The big news for the last week, or even before that, but you know,
quite a while.
January 1st was the deadline, America's fiscal cliff. And for those who have had their head buried in the sand, it was the date by which they had to make an agreement on the budget. Without an agreement, all it would have automatic budget cuts would have been implemented and tax rises. And so what they did is they worked out some kind of deal, but in actual fact, Craig, they didn't resolve anything. They, as an American put it to us, they reached an agreement to postpone reaching an agreement. And they've effectively kicked the can on this down the road over the next 90 days. Now in 90 days, they have a few things to do which are quite serious. They have to negotiate a rise to America's debt ceiling, which is already over $16 trillion, so they've got to increase that more. Or if they don't do that, they risk defaulting on their bonds, the US government bonds, which would be a disaster for America and the world. Also, in the next 90 days, you have these automatic budget cuts to defence and welfare, and this is $1 trillion worth of cuts. This will be enormously damaging in terms of just the flow of money through the system at the moment. Now, the thing is though, because most people don't pay attention to the details, it was reported, oh yeah, we've reached an agreement, right? The markets rallied straight away. The next day there was the biggest stock market rally on the New York Stock Exchange for a year as a result. But the real issue showed itself within 24 hours, because the day after, which was our last night as we speak here, the markets crashed again. Why? They crashed because of the worries that have been starting to dawn on people about the effect of the Federal Reserve's money printing. Now this is quite serious. We've been screaming about this for a long time, and when I say we, our US associates led by Lyndon LaRouche. Here's what's happening in America. The Federal Reserve is spending $80 billion a month buying Treasury bills, that's from the US Treasury, and $40 billion a month buying rubbish investment paper, mortgage-backed securities and the like, from private banks. That's $120 billion a month combined, and that is printed money. Now, they call this quantitative easing. So what I've done is I've brought along, for the purposes of today's discussion, Craig, you could look this up. The Bank of England very kindly put out a pamphlet a little while ago, Quantitative Easing Explained, putting more money into our economy to boost spending. And in that, we'll put this on the screen, they have a diagram that shows this wonderful mechanism for increasing the money supply. But what they admit is quantitative easing is nothing but creating money out of thin air. So when we say printing money, that's a metaphor, because it's electronic. They don't actually have to print it anymore like they did 70 or 80 years ago in Germany, but it's the electronic version of printing money. The bank creates money and uses it to buy assets such as government bonds and high quality debt from private companies, and then that gets pumped through the economy. So this is money that is the modern electronic form of printed money. The Federal Reserve in America is putting out $120 billion of it a month. That money multiplies. Whenever a bank lends out money, right, that multiplies by any number of factor.
Because it comes back to other banks in the form of deposits and then is relent, and that's the way it works.
So on average, it's probably about 10 times it increases, right? So you're talking about around $1 trillion every month, just in the American financial system, of money that's not backed by anything being pumped out. The European Central Bank is doing quantitative easing. The Bank of England's doing quantitative easing, and now the Bank of Japan under the new government is doing its own form of quantitative easing. This is the big issue in the world, that we've never seen so much money printed like this in history. So, Craig, the fiscal cliff was a threat, but only a threat to the way this system is functioning at the moment, this system of money printing. That's what it was a threat to, because it would have been like a logjam on the American side of it. Isn't the money printing the real threat, the much bigger threat to the world?
Well, Robbie, the focus on the money itself is the problem. Look, money is nothing but a means of exchange for the purchase of goods and services. That's all it's ever supposed to be. So where's the fall down point here? It's the issue of goods and services.
Yep.
What you're doing is basically saying is, through the fact that we created all this debt through speculative activities in the last 30 to 40 years, we have to create more money to service that debt. And what is not looked at is, okay, well, if we have all this money then created, what does that mean relative to the physical economy? What are we actually producing? And when we refer to the hyperinflation model of Weimar Germany, what happened back then was that the repatriation of the German debt,
the war reparations.
The war reparations of the German debt.
The British and French punished Germany for World War I and said, you've got to pay 5 billion marks.
Yeah, and what happened was they took all the cattle, they took all the actual physical goods, and under those war reparations, Germany said, well, the only way we can pay this debt is by printing money. But that money is seen as worthless because there's nothing underpinning it in the economy.
Yeah, and in Germany, the hyperinflation that erupted was limited to one country and one currency. We're talking now on a global scale.
The US dollar is the international, it's the global reserve currency. Everything is denominated in US dollars. So the minute you start to weaken the US dollar by printing more of them just artificially, it affects the entire global economy. And you know, you're talking about interest rates at less than 1% in the US based on these T-bills that they're buying. And how does that affect Australia? Well, Australia has some of the highest interest rates in the world, and consequently, we are being flooded, in a sense, by US dollars, trying to buy up our Australian dollars, which has a devastating effect on our internal economy. So this is a monetary system, Robbie. Everything is based upon speculation of trying to pay off the unpayable debt. $16.7 trillion of US debt is completely unpayable. The only solution is the Glass-Steagall proposal, like was used for Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. This is gaining a lot more traction in the US. We were told by an American colleague the other day that something like 25%, close to 25% of congressmen are now supporting the idea of a Glass-Steagall. Of course, Obama doesn't, because he's the one that's actually bailed the banks out. But to the degree that there's a Glass-Steagall, this means that what happens is you literally quarantine that debt. The debt that belongs to the private banking system is basically quarantined. It's frozen. It's not paid back. And then you reinstitute the national banking system of the United States through the idea of a national bank, reissue large amounts of credit, which is not just spent in the economy propping up bad debt, but is spent for the purposes of really developing the physical economy. In the US, it's things like the NWAPA, the North American Water and Power Alliance, which is a huge program to put 3 to 5 million people back into work.
Well, let's just contrast the difference there, because under quantitative easing and this money printing, the Fed puts money into the private banks, and those banks get to do with it as they wish. And what they wish is anything that's most profitable for them. And what's profitable is not spending it on infrastructure or spending it, lending it to a factory or a small business. It's they're always looking for the next speculative gamble, right? And that's how that money goes. So at no stage along its the circuit of this money is it backed by anything. Whereas what we're talking about with the National Bank would put new money into the economy, but that money is limited to creating something.
Yes.
So that
bringing an intention into fruition is what creating this sort of credit's about. So at the end of the day, you have a real asset, not fictitious numbers on the books of banks.
And you've generated the wealth that
employs
when
people.
That debt retires, we'll be able to pay that debt back.
Yes, and meanwhile you've employed people to work in those industries. You've increased the tax flows that are possible. You've given the economy what it actually needs, and that is you've underpinned basic and crucial economic infrastructure by cheap credit to expand the economy. You don't hear this talk when you're talking about a monetary system. In this whole quantitative easing is not based upon any reference to the productive economy at all.
Well, Craig, in the last month or so, the LaRouche movement in the US, LaRouche PAC, has released a pamphlet on the US President Andrew Jackson, called How Andrew Jackson Destroyed the United States, which I recommend people read, because what that goes through is a very thorough examination of the workings of the second bank of the United States, which was America's second national bank under John Quincy Adams. And you see an example of a national bank functioning like what we're advocating now, and you see the role, they called it the internal improvement system. This bank really boosted America's economy in a very significant way. So significantly, we'll finish on this anecdote, when the great Australian founding father, the Reverend John Dunmore Lang, took his first and only visit to the United States around 1830, he had been used to visiting London to go and beg for improvements to New South Wales. And London, of course, was the London of Charles Dickens, teeming masses of poverty. He went to America and he was struck how the average American was educated, a skilled tradesman, and had a high income. And that happened because you had the government with this bank constantly investing in infrastructure and improvements, and everyone was brought along with that system, right? So I heartily recommend any viewers who want to master this subject, contact us and get a copy of this, order a copy of this pamphlet and read it. It's very, very valuable.
And I think, Robbie, over the course of these next several, over the next several programs at least, we'll start to do programs on exactly what this means for Australia.
Yep. All right, we'll leave it there. When we come back, we're going to talk about a topical issue in Australia at the moment, which is how Jenny Macklin should get a real job. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Families Minister Jenny Macklin should get a real job. So if you've been watching the news this week, Jenny, as of 1st of January, this austerity measure that the Gillard government passed last year, Craig, to push single parents off a single parenting allowance and put them onto New Start, kicks in, right, as of the 1st of January. And basically what it means is that the average single parent will lose anywhere from $60 to $110 a week. And they're on the New Start allowance, and the New Start allowance is $35 a day.
Which is designed for people to look for work. And the idea is to shift the burden from, basically the supporting parents to forcing them into a situation to find work where there isn't that many jobs.
And it's for us to think, well, they are a burden, when of course, there's a lot that single parents do that, if they got they've got kids, they often make a contribution to their school in terms of time and volunteering and all that kind of thing. And that is, as someone who's in that position, involved in a school, that's invaluable. Anyway, so Jenny Macklin's kicked them to the gutter. And then she was at a press conference and she was asked, could she live on $35 a day?
This is a minister that's getting $6,500 a week to live on.
Could you live on $35 a day? And she said, yes, I could. And then, of course, they lied by trying to cover up in the transcript. So, really?
I can't, Robbie. I can tell you that right now.
I can't either. Here's the thing. There's been a backlash to this, a lot of calls for her to go live on the dole for a week, see what it's like. That's all rubbish. Jenny Macklin should get a real job. Now, what do I mean by that? That's a message to Jenny Macklin from the grave. And it's coming from Frank Anstey and John Curtin, two of the greatest Labor politicians who ever lived in Australia. Because they set an example in the Great Depression. Now, in 1931, the Labor government, there was a Labor government, the Scullin Labor government was in power. The Bank of England set out this fascist little upstart named Sir Otto Niemeyer to dictate to Australia a 25% across the board wage cut so that funds could be freed up to keep paying British bondholders. And the Scullin government got to its knees and said, we've got to do this. Frank Anstey, who was the mentor for John Curtin, the future Prime Minister, they opposed this furiously. Now, the argument in the Labor Party at the time, Craig, was, well, we've got to do it, but it's better we do it as a Labor government because we can probably soften the blow than those heartless Tories doing it. Of course, the end result's the same, right? And Anstey and Curtin ripped into this, and their argument was this: if the Labor government is going to hurt working class people instead of help them, it shouldn't be in government. They actually argued for resigning from government instead of implementing this dastardly the plan, because what they're arguing for was principle above politics. And Frank Anstey was a particularly passionate individual when it come to the common good of the people, and he said, he attacked his government. He said, this government is crucifying the very people who raised its members from obscurity and placed them in power. Now, that didn't prevail. Their argument didn't prevail. They were outvoted by the majority of the Labor caucus. Of course, a big chunk of the people who outvoted them later split very soon after that split, led by Joe Lyons, and went and joined Robert Menzies in forming a new party, so they weren't genuine Labor anyway. But that's the example that Labor once was represented by with those great men. And unfortunately, Macklin has displayed a real decay that's happened since then. And we've put out a press release this week, Craig, entitled "Jenny Macklin is the picture of Dorian Gray." Because if anyone knows the story, the Oscar Wilde story, Dorian Gray did a deal, sold his soul, and he became immortal, and he never aged, but there was a portrait of him that he kept up in his attic that aged instead of him. And didn't just age, it decayed, it looked awful, it looked evil, it was horrible. It was a picture of his actual soul on this portrait. And here's Labor today, pretending to be the party of working families, as Kevin Rudd used to parrot on ad nauseum, and yet they're doing this. And for Macklin to so callously say, yeah, I could live on, and flippantly, yeah, I could live on $35 a day, when everyone knows that there's no way that's possible. It just shows you how far they've fallen since Bob Hawke and Paul Keating sold this party's soul to the City of London in the 1980s. So there's the editorial on it. Craig, what you said before, though, is the real issue here, isn't it? Which is that the welfare groups like ACOS have come out, and normally the welfare groups argue in a situation like this. They argue, oh, the Australian economy is doing really well, therefore we should be happy to share with poor people, which is a rubbish argument because the Australian economy isn't doing well. What ACOS has come out saying this time is that, hang on, you keep saying that the dole is set at this rate to encourage people to find work. There are no jobs. Doesn't this show up the real state of the Australian economy?
Well, Robbie, look, I always go back to the same period of time as Scullin and Scullin government, because there was a real battle going on there with the City of London. And that particular time, Ted Theodore, the Treasurer at that point, proposed an £18 million fiduciary note issue. In other words, create credit backed by simple paper currency through the power of the government.
Don't cut wages.
Don't cut wages.
Increase the economy.
Create 40 to 50,000 jobs, which would in crucial industries for public works, which would in turn create another 40 to 50,000 follow-on jobs, and put people into good, well-meaning paid jobs. The problem we have today, Robbie, the Labor and the Liberal Party, there is no difference. There is no fundamental difference between the two parties at a philosophical level whatsoever. They're both engorging themselves on globalisation, free trade, economic rationalism, and the love and protection of the banking system. Unless you go back to old Labor policies, real old Labor policies that were championed by Curtin, Chifley, Theodore and others, of national banking for credit creation, of sovereignty, of protectionism in order to protect Australian industries, and then you act outside the interest of private bankers, then there is no solution. And that's what we put in our press release, and that's the direction that people have to wake up to. Otherwise, they too are going to be on the dole queue before too long, not getting enough money.
Yep. Read the press release, people. It's on our website. All right, we'll leave it there. When we come back, we're going to talk about this dispute in the South China Sea. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, the South China Sea dispute can be solved without war. Craig, there are hundreds, literally hundreds of tiny little islands that are no more than rocks, most of them, in the South China Sea. But the Anglo-American elements who are pushing for a war with China are trying to use the dispute over these islands, there's the Spratly and the Dayu and a whole bunch of them, between Japan and China and the Philippines and all the countries that are sort of circulating the South China Sea. They want to use those islands to get this war with China going. So in the time we've got left, can you shed some light on this situation and also talk about a real solution to the dispute?
Yeah, Robbie, I wanted to raise this because what happens is people in the media, our viewers in the media, would hear about these South China Sea islands. The Chinese have just sent warships into the Spratly Islands or something, right? And the reason this is important is because we've published last year 2 new citizens. One was back in June, which was British Crown's Endgame Financial Crash and Nuclear War. And the second was Act Now, Stop Nuclear War. Join Lyndon LaRouche, Malcolm Fraser to promote peace. Expose Hugh White, Michael Danby in the push for war. Now, what happened over the Christmas break was that Hugh White, the guy that we exposed in this publication, came out and said, he wrote an article in the Sydney Morning Herald called Caught in a Bind That Threatens an Asian War Nobody Wants, Hugh White. And he picked up on this issue of the islands that are disputed between Japan and China. This is the Senkakus Islands, which Japan calls them, or China calls them the Diaoyu Islands. Now, these are small islands in the South China Sea, and Japan last September claimed sovereignty over these islands, whereas before these were in dispute. Now, what Hugh White comes out and says, well, this is similar to what happened in the Peloponnesian War back in the 5th century BC, where the rise of Athens was seen as a threat to Sparta, therefore they had to have a war. And they had to have a war in order to resolve the issue, because people were threatened, the Spartans were threatened by the Athenians. The problem is that Sparta was an oligarchical culture, Robbie. It was very much adopted and was like the British Empire today, and it saw the rise of Athens with the great thinkers like Socrates and Plato and so forth as a threat. So it's very interesting that Hugh White, the guy that we exposed in our papers, coming out using that exact example. And the solution is not that. The solution is not the strongest, the survival of the fittest, or zero-sum game, or the winner takes all approach, which is the approach of the British East India Company of the British Empire.
The advantage of the stronger.
The advantage of the stronger, exactly. The issue is not that. We were talking to a colleague this week who said he was speaking to some fairly high-level military officials in the United States who said that China and Japan should look at the islands in the North Sea as an example of how you handle a situation.
You mean up in the Arctic?
Up in the Arctic, yeah. Right up higher than the North Sea, yeah. And what he said was that you don't worry about the ownership. You create a treaty for the advantage of the other, for the advantage of everyone, actually, where you say, okay, we together are going to create a treaty to develop these islands. We'll worry about the ownership further down the track when things change.
Because there is apparently oil and gas reserves there, which could be quite beneficial for all the countries in the region.
So instead of having all these disputes around these little tiny rocks, have joint treaties to say we'll develop these islands and these resources jointly. We'll share the resources amongst ourselves, and we won't worry about their specific ownership. As soon as you start talking about who owns what, who has the more power than what, which plays into domestic political agendas, then you end up with a potential trigger for war, and that's a very dangerous situation when you've got the British Empire trying to promote a nuclear war with China and Russia right now.
Yeah. All right, thanks for that, Craig. Well, that's it for this week's CEC report. We'll be on every week again for the rest of the year, and in I think 3 capital cities now, so enjoy watching us. Call us on 1-800-636-432 for a copy of that special report, and thanks for tuning in.